Preventing, recognizing, and reporting abuse. Policy manual. All covered individuals are required to report any reasonable suspicion of a crime to the state survey agency and local law enforcement. A covered individual is any owner, operator, employee, manager, agent, or contractor of a long-term care facility, hospice agency providing service in a long-term care facility, or in an intermediate care facility for the individuals with intellectual disabilities. The determination of whether a situation rises to the level of a crime depends on state and local laws. A covered individual must file their report within 2 hours if serious bodily injury occurred because of the incident, or within 24 hours if there was no serious bodily injury. Extreme physical pain, substantial risk for death, long-lasting loss or impairment of the function of a bodily member, organ, or mental faculty, and the need for medical interventions such as surgery, hospitalization, or physical rehabilitation. Continued policy manual. Our organization prohibits retaliation against an employee who has made a report under the Elder Justice Act. Failure to comply with the reporting requirements under this act can result in the covered individual receiving a civil money penalty of up to $200,000 and exclusion from participation in any federal health care program. This penalty may increase to $300,000 if a failure to report results in increased harm to the victim of the crime. In these situations, the covered individual will be required to file a report with the state survey agency and local law enforcement under the Elder Justice Act, notify the facility administrator in accordance with the federal regulations governing long-term facilities. Abuse prevention policy. Identify situations that may foster abuse, inadequate staffing, isolated environment, and lack of supervision. Identify situations that increase caregiver stress level. Make sure employees have adequate training on dealing with difficult behaviors or heavy nursing care. Recognize the signs of stress, burnout, feeling tired or drained, changed in appetite, feeling lonely or helpless, lack of emotion, decrease in job satisfaction, frustrated, attendance problems, using food, drugs, or alcohol to cope. Most common reasons for abuse by caregiver. If you recognize the above signs, intervene before the situation is out of control. Speak to supervisor, getting sleep, exercise, and eat healthy. Unwind physically and mentally. Avoid working excessive hours and removing yourself from a situation that may cause frustration. Definitions: abuse, the willful infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. Willful, the individual must have acted deliberately, not that the individual must have intended to inflict injury or harm. Exploitation, the unfair treatment or use of a resident or the taking of a selfish or unfair advantage of a resident for personal gain through manipulation, intimidation, threat, or coercion. Misappropriation of resident property, deliberate misplacement, exploitation, wrongful, temporary, or permanent use of a resident's belonging or money without the resident's consent. Neglect, the facility and its employees are neglectful when a reasonable person would conclude that a deprivation of the omitted goods and services would cause, among other things, emotional distress rather than mental disorder. Mistreatment, inappropriate treat or exploit a resident. Continue with the definitions. Sexual abuse, non-consensual sexual contact of any type with a resident. Adverse event, an undesirable, unanticipated event that causes death or serious injury or the risk thereof. Person-centered care, focusing on the resident as an individual to which they have control over their own choices and having control over their own daily lives. Resident representative includes both an individual of the resident's choice who has access to information and participates in healthcare discussions, as well as personal representative with legal standing such as power of attorney for healthcare, legal guardian, or healthcare surrogate or proxy appointed in accordance with the state law to act in whole or in part on the resident's behalf. Signs of abuse: neglect, poor hygiene, depression, fear, hopelessness, withdrawal, Childish behavior when not previously shown, crying, agitation, indifference around specific people. Misappropriation of property, subtle type of abuse and may be difficult to recognize. Sudden change in bank account, changes to legal documents, unexplained disappearance of possessions, sudden appearance of previously uninvolved relatives. Exploitation, mistreatment. Exploitation occurs when someone takes advantage of a person for personal gain through manipulation, intimidation, threats, or coercion. Mistreatment is the inappropriate treatment or exploitation of an individual. Abuse, willful, deliberate infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or punishment with resulting physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. Deprivation by an individual of goods or services that are necessary for a person's physical, mental, and psychosocial well-being, regardless of any mental, cognitive, or physical conditions as a person has to cause harm, pain, or mental anguish. Isolation is a factor that increases the risk for abuse. Report your suspicions of abuse to your supervisor. You do not have to make sure that abuse has occurred before making a report. Physical abuse, use of physical force to cause injury, pain, or impairment. Corporal punishment is a type of physical abuse that involves intentional punishment of a person in order to change behavior. Example would be slapping a person's hand for touching you inappropriately. Not limited to hitting, kicking, pushing, or burning. Physical and chemical restraints can be physical abuse, and multiple bruises of different colors is likely to indicate that abuse has occurred. Sexual abuse. Non-consensual sexual contact, harassment, or coercion against a person's will, inability to give consent because of physical or mental limitations, persuading a person to perform sexual acts with the use of physical force or verbal threats, unwanted touching, inappropriate comments, requests of a sexual nature, rape, sodomy, coerced nudity, and sexual explicit photography. Mental abuse. Emotional or psychological abuse in the use of verbal or nonverbal acts to inflict pain, anguish, distress, shame, insecurity, or lack of control. Includes humiliation, intimidation, harassment, taking away privileges, or threats of harm or punishment. Verbal abuse, which is the use of oral, written, or gestured language directed towards another person or within hearing distance of that person with the intent of hurting, offending, or frightening the person, talking disrespectfully, and scolding. Involuntary seclusion involves intentional separation of a person from other people or certain places against that person's will or the will of their legal guardian. Taking away a person's privileges is an example of mental abuse. Misappropriation of property. Financial abuse, deliberate misplacement, exploitation, or wrongful use of a person's belongings or money without their consent through misrepresentation, coercion, or outright theft. Using a person's money for something other than their expenses, stealing or borrowing money or property. Charging for services not rendered or not needed, and sudden change in legal documents. Neglect. Failure to provide goods and services necessary to avoid physical harm, pain, emotional distress, or mental anguish. When a person and/or their environment does not get the proper attention, endangering that personal physical and/or mental health. Failure to act, an omission, or something not done. While abuse is always intentional, neglect may be intentional or unintentional. Necessities such as food, water, clothing, shelter, personal hygiene, healthcare, comfort, and personal safety. Lack of emotional support, ignoring a person's emotional needs, respect, and love. Abandonment is a form of neglect.